Brothers and sisters, welcome to the Son of the North podcast. I am your host Rex, serving as your guiding light through the darkness of this age. This is the 10th episode of this podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to follow us on Spotify, YouTube, BitChute, Google Podcasts, and all other platforms where podcasts can be found. Without further delay, let's get into today's episode. Brothers and sisters, welcome to the Son of the North podcast. I am your host Rex, serving as your guiding light through the darkness of this age. Fall is almost upon us, and to get into the true spirit of fall, I've decided that we're going to focus on darker themes. Today, I have a good friend of mine, Tyto. He's an American pagan from the deep south and the leader of a growing lunar cult. Tyto, how are you doing today, brother?
I'm doing wonderful. How are you tonight?
Just living the dream. Just came back from a picnic with my woman. Went down into a little river valley, sat by the river, had a nice picnic, and I soaked up some sun to keep it PG. Yeah, it was a great day.
Those are the sorts of days that we always remember most.
Oh, yes. In dark times like these, we have to remember those happy, shining moments. For those who might not be familiar with you, Tyto, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit more?
Well, I'm Tyto. I've been a pagan for about 8 years. My journey was a weird start. I grew up Catholic, which those of you who are Catholic know that it's paganism light. My wife is a practicing Druidess. She's been so for 20 years. About 8 years ago, through, of all things, airsoft morale patches, I discovered that the D&D god, Tyr, who was my favorite god, was an actual god. And that put me on my journey down through Norse paganism. During this time period, I've met numerous people like yourself, and 3 of them have become very close to me, and we've banded our ideas together about paganism in general, and for lack of a better term, have started a cult based around the moon. I've recently taken the role of, what we call it, Merlin in our group.
Merlin, that's interesting. So what are the responsibilities that your new position entails?
Well, as Merlin, I'm somewhat responsible for the spiritual and emotional health of the group, even though we're only, at this point, with children, 8 members. But it's important that we take care of each other. It's also my role to guide and ensure that we don't fall off into any traps. Spiritually, it's very easy to get caught in a cyclic rhythm where you do the same things over and over again, but you never grow. You never learn more. It's a problem that I saw in Christianity, and one of the reasons it was so easy for me to leave Christianity.
Yes, I've noticed that in so many spiritualities, it's so easy to get caught into a sort of routine or rhythm, and your spiritual progression is really limited, particularly in groups where the institutions are so rigid. And I think that's one of the beauties of the structure of your cult, for lack of a better word, in that the small size of your group and your closeness together allows you to all encourage your own further spiritual progression along your path. As a follower of the sun god Sol, progression along what we would call the solar path is such an important part of my beliefs. Tell me exactly how, in your words, you progress spiritually as a devotee of the moon.
So it all starts off with the sun. The moon reflects the light of the sun. We see Sol as a grandfatherly, loving figure, somewhat absent minded. He's there and he loves us and he gives life to the earth, but he's not near as involved in the day to day struggles as the closer celestial body, the moon, and the other adversaries and pantheons. Part of moving on and learning more is the phases of the moon. Each of us has a moon phase that we've been kind of assigned to, and that's considered your phase. And during that time, when that phase is up, you have to perform ritual. You have to do something to increase your connection to whatever it is you believe.
I see. So your practices in your personal spiritual development are very much connected to the cycles of nature.
Exactly. The full belief is that the great solar wheel is a thing. Even though we worship the moon primarily, we don't have a push against the sun itself. The sun's not our enemy. He's grandfather. He's the wise figure in the sky.
I've noticed a very interesting trend in pagan circles recently, and I think this all ties in. I've talked about this topic in other podcasts, the growth of the solar movement. Although it's pagan in its origins, it seems like some non-pagan groups have tried to co-opt it. And it's very interesting because some of them try to present the moon as a sort of adversarial figure or enemy or rival of the sun, and that the lunar path is, a path into degeneration in opposition to the solar path, which is a path towards enlightenment. But I don't really think that's the case. I mean, we know from Indo-European mythology that the moon and the sun are obviously connected, whether they are siblings or any other sort of relation, sometimes lovers. But also, like you said, the moon itself isn't a glowing celestial body. It just reflects the light of the sun. And that way, they're quite directly linked.
Exactly. And I've encountered those pagans who believe in the moon's opposition. You had a post on Instagram a few days ago talking about Lilith, and there's always been a great tie amongst the feminine Wiccan belief structure with Lilith and the moon. And we don't really have that trend in our group. We see the moon as the mother to certain groups of people on this earth. And we personally believe that we are the descendants of the moon. Personal belief that I have is somewhere back in the time of heroes and legends, somewhere in my family, Luna sired a child with one of my ancestors and created a bloodline. And that's where it comes from for me. Do I believe I'm the actual flesh and blood child of the moon? No. One of our members does, but he's a little weird.
There's always one in every group.
He's a little weird. He's a little weird, but everyone believes different things. My buddy Joshua, he's Norse. My buddy Sol, well, it's pretty clear that he's Roman. His entire thing is Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. My buddy Mishra, he is what happens whenever you stick somebody in California for too long, which I don't know if you've ever been to California, but it has a heavy occult basis that even traces back to the 1920s with the early work of scientists out there in the space program, through Scientology, through the Summer of Love and other things in the hippies. These are all esoteric movements that happened right under the nose of pop culture or political movements.
Oh yeah, definitely. And it all gets caught up and branded in that satanic panic. You brought up a really good point that I want to touch on again, on this idea of the gods of our ancestors, not just being deities worshipped by our ancestors, but to an extent being our ancestors themselves. I personally believe that the vast majority of the Indo-European tribes are descended from Sol, and that at various points throughout history, the gods will once again reintegrate themselves genetically into these bloodlines. The most famous example being among the Trojans, there was Aeneas, who was the son of the goddess of love. So I think we need to realize that the cults of the gods and the cults of the ancestors are actually quite intricately linked.
Oh, incredibly so. Blood is such an important thing in the pagan belief structure that most modern, what I like to call bookstore pagans, don't take into account. You can't pick up a book and just read it and suddenly you're tapped into who you are. I struggled my first 3 years in paganism with Norse paganism because it didn't fit and I tried to make it fit. And it wasn't until I broke away from that and started researching the Gallic gods, the Celtic gods, where my family is from. That's when that click started to happen. And that's when I discovered what fit with me, what deity speaks to me more than any other.
People will feel most comfortable around certain interpretations of the gods. Quite often, those gods are the interpretations that your most direct genetic ancestors would have worshipped. And this is perfectly theologically sound for me as Indo-European pagan, because I would imagine that these are all iterations of the original ancestral Indo-European gods and them manifesting themselves in a form that's most palatable for a person based on their own cultural leaning. Yeah, I'd love if you could talk a little bit more about how the members of your cult integrate your different beliefs together regarding the different quote unquote pantheons of the gods.
I'll give you the best example: Soul's wife, Erica. She worships the Morgan. She is a full Celtic believer in the Morgan. Her husband, he has this belief in Soul. So during high holidays, during anything special, she'll make her offerings first. She'll set up everything, do everything. And then he will come and he will make his offerings. And there will be an almost juxtaposition of ideas and beliefs because the Romans conquered the Celts. So there's that respect to what happened in the past while still honoring both deities, or in Soul's case, the massive Roman pantheon.
I'm not sure if you read through my most recent series of posts talking about the fall of Rome, but that got so much attention. And I think it's because even if you're not ancestrally linked to the Romans per se through genetics, or maybe you are genetically linked to a region that was conquered by the Romans, but they're still so fascinating because given the fact that they conquered so many different regions of the Indo-European deities and integrated and equated their own Roman deities with the Celtic or Germanic deities, it offers a really good lens at looking at our traditions as a whole. And I think there's something about that that attracts so many people.
Oh, it definitely does. There is so much interlink between Rome and anywhere else. And let's just be honest about the Romans themselves. One of the ways they conquered was through breeding and procreation and taking over that way. Everyone in Europe is related to a Roman in some way. Every one of us mutts has some Italian DNA in us. We cannot deny it. People who try to deny it, just you haven't gone far back enough. There's a Roman legionnaire in your family tree.
Man, at this point, it's just continuation of the Indo-European tradition, you know? It's just ancestral memories reincarnated.
That's something that I personally haven't experienced. My best friend, she has gone through the ancestral memory thing, and it's wonderful and terrifying to behold at the same time. But I've never had that experience of ancestral memories. I've never had that experience of seeing what they saw. All of my stuff has been based in my own unique personal gnosis, which is what I call whenever something that's beyond the veil, whenever something like that has happened to me, I've tied it into, okay, this is what happened to me.
Interesting, interesting. Do you have any interesting stories about events that you would be happy to share with my audience?
Of course. This is probably the weirdest event. Now, mind you, I was 20 and still Catholic at the time when this happened. Near my home, there is a former World War II Army base. It was stood up during the war. Hundreds of thousands of troops went through it. And after the war, it was abandoned and nature has taken it over. It's one of the most beautiful and haunting places that you can go to. You can find the ruins of old buildings. You can find the ruins of old bunkers and pillboxes. You can look on maps. I actually have a map of the area on my wall right now. And now, when I was younger, I used to, like most of us, grab a gun and go out into the woods with my friends.
That stalker role play, Shadow of Chernobyl type stuff.
Exactly. I was carrying a German K98 bolt action rifle, and me and my friends were out in the woods, and I was on point. Well, I stepped into a clearing, beautiful clearing, and this is a bright sunny day. There's nothing there. And I notice about 30 yards away something out of the corner of my eye. So I turn and look, and there is a creature standing there. It is about 9 foot tall, black, solid black. The hands are elongated. I couldn't tell if they were claws or not, but elongated hands with a deer skull face. Well, my first instinct was to pull the trigger. So I shot it 5 times. And so I shot the thing, and after it cocked its head to the side and just looked at me like I was stupid or that it was amused, and it disappeared from my sight. Gone.
Interesting.
Now, when my friends run up hearing me shoot 5 times, wondering what the hell just happened, I'm blabbering along, raising my finger up to where the thing was. They went over, there was no blood, no bullet holes, nothing in the trees behind it, no evidence that my rounds went anywhere other than I intended. We scooped up the brass and we got out of there. It's the most terrified I've ever been in my life. I don't think it was hostile to me. I happen to think that it was, like you mentioned, the gods checking up on us. I happen to think it was one of my ancestral gods checking up on me. And since then, I've left offerings to him.
Almost as a way of like making up with him, for the offense.
Well, at first it was, I was Catholic, so it was, hey, I'm going to the woods, don't do anything to me. And then once I became pagan, with help from my moon cult and my best friend, I learned what it was through, once again, unique personal gnosis. My belief is the creature is the Lord of Winter, the horn god. The Celts call him Cernus, but there's so many different versions of him all throughout Europe. This deer skull or antlered god who's the god of the forest. There's so many different variants of him.
Oh, definitely. The horn god's very clearly a quite ancient deity, perhaps even with Indo-European links itself. I mean, we can see it. The most classical other example of him would be the god Pan among the Greeks. It is a very similar kind of creature, dealing with the woods, and it has that particular association with those horns.
Well, after my introduction to paganism, I started doing research instead. When you have that sort of experience, you try to figure out what it was. Was I crazy? Did I hit my head on something? You try to rationalize it away. Anyone who has one of these actual experiences, I've learned, they'll always try to rationalize it away before they have to just stare it in the eye and realize what it is. And well, it was the horn god. So I started doing my research and learning more and researching more, and kind of figured out some of the other stuff that I had encountered, seen in that area. I did cryptid research in the area. There was always reports of weird things in that area. The woods themselves out there are definitely a place of power. And once me and my best friend, me and her became as close as we are, she had an experience, which it's her story to tell and not mine, but it kind of confirmed to me that this is what this is. And now I see him not as something to be afraid of, but he's part of my family.
Whoever it was clearly taking quite an interest in you. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people who I wouldn't call them false pagans, but who are very superficially pagan. And they hear stories like of your encounter with this horned deity, or of my encounter in Rome. The classic scientific way to jump it is clearly you're mentally unstable, you're having some sort of episode or whatnot. And it's such a silly thing. I mean, if we look at the myths of our ancestors, they encountered the gods quite often in our historical sources, sometimes very directly, or sometimes, just through messages in their head. And so I don't understand why a person who is fated to spread the word of the gods, or a person actively seeking the gods themselves, wouldn't have some sort of encounter like this.
It's, to me, I can understand their skepticism. I always look at things from a lens of skepticism. And where I'm from, we have this thing called fluffy bunnies. We call them fluffy bunnies. They're pagans who every week they have a new personal experience with the gods. Every week it's new, some sort of new encounter, a new revelation they're getting, or that they're fated and special or something like this. I don't think I was fated and special. I think he was bored. I think he was bored and decided to mess with me, because a lot of the stories that I've gotten from different horn god stuff pretty much indicates that he gets bored. He's the god of the woods, the god of the hunt. He's one of the reasons that we associate hunting with fall and winter time is because of his dominion over fall and winter. Because of one of the stories that I've heard of him, he basically slew the summer huntsman, not out of jealousy or rage, but to protect us, because summer was taking greedily of the land. And he knew that we would not survive the winter without these deer, these game animals. So he slew summer to stop it, which is what started the war between summer and winter.
Oh, no kidding. Yeah, that's a battle that lasts to this day. I mean, even in the pagan community, you get the people who are like, oh, I love the summer. I love going to the beach. I love soaking up the sun. Then you get the other people, it's like, oh no, I love the cold, darkness, and the atmosphere of death in the air in the winter. That's a very interesting story. I mean, it kind of explains almost an odd association of hunting with the winter and the fall. And in my area, nothing grows on the ground in the winter. Obviously, it's -40. There's several feet of snow on the ground. So hunting is almost a necessity for survival. And definitely in the summer here, we can hunt bear. But other than that, you can't hunt anything because not only do the species, need to reproduce, pass on their genes, and grow the next generation. But if you took too much in the summer, then you definitely wouldn't have the game reserves to survive the winter.
It is my second favorite Huntsman story that I've been told. My first favorite Huntsman story is the story that my friend Sol's wife told me. Her belief structure is Celtic based. And in her religion, Huntsman Keranos, he's a prominent figure. Well, they have a very interesting belief about one of his roles is witch killer. That if someone is practicing magic and taking advantage of people, he's the one who stops that. So the story goes that a lady queen, this ancient Irish Celtic woman, was ruling over this land, and she was a witch. She was using dark adversarial magic. They made offerings to the gods, but none of the gods listened. So a young man one day decided that he was going to stop her. So he got together with his group and they went and they stormed her castle and they fought her. And it was him. He was the last one left alive at the end. He was facing her down and she defeated him. And right as she was about to kill him, the huntsman appeared behind her, wrapped her in darkness, and snatched her away to the other side of the veil, the Feywild, whatever you want to call it. So he was left there, denied his victory, but given respite by the huntsman, if only for the reason that it was the right thing to do. It's one of those weird allegorical stories that you have floating around modern paganism. I've found zero evidence of it in anything I've researched. She heard it from the woman who taught her the beginnings of worship in the Morgan. So it's very much one of those things that could just be a product of American paganism's weird creation.
That's a particularly interesting thing, examining this lens of how these stories come up that aren't in the sources as people seeking to rekindle the fire of our ancestral traditions. The historical written sources we have are so incredibly valuable for understanding how our ancestors saw the gods and saw the world around them. But more or less, our traditions aren't static and they're growing. And even among our ancestors, the oral telling of stories, the oral tradition was so important and something so often neglected by modern pagans because of our bias for written sources. And it wouldn't surprise me that if, in theory, this cult of the Morgan has continued on from times ancient in secret, how this oral story could be passed on.
My opinion of it is it could be real. It fits with how he acts. Personally, she's terrified of him as his role as witch slayer. Even in Roman times, there was a predisposition against witches. Someone gains too much magical power and they have to be stopped. So, could this be true? Being involved with it for as long as I have, American paganism is a funny thing. I live in Louisiana, which is probably the most pagan state in the United States. We have New Orleans and we have Catholicism breeding offshoots. Off the top of my head, I can name 7 active practicing pagans who are actually practicing, quite a few people who are just LARPing. So you would not believe the simple amount of times that I've had to tell somebody when going to an event, no, you don't have to dress up like a Viking.
Lots of those.
We call it Ragnar syndrome down here.
Yeah, I guess that's the History Channel effect.
We actually hadn't had a name for it because the first group that I went with was a group of all military Norse worshippers. And those were the first pagans that I had met in real life. Absolutely wonderful individuals. You could never get close into their organization unless you had served in combat and actually fought.
This all ties back into this concept of dharma, and particularly the dharma of a warrior, kshatriya, being this concept of righteous war. And warfare for the sake of warfare in some traditions is inherently a good thing. But on a spiritual level, for the Norse, would people fighting in Iraq or Afghanistan really be fighting a righteous warfare that would earn them a spot in Valhalla? Maybe, maybe not. But regardless, I can guarantee you almost all of those exclusive pagans who are in the military who are like, oh, you don't understand. You're not a fighter. You're not a warrior in the modern sense, and therefore you could never get into Valhalla or stuff like that. Like, it's such a silly exclusive thing because arguably, are they even getting into Valhalla? Are they fighting against the adversaries? One could argue they're fighting in favor of the adversaries to further their schemes. So yeah, I don't get why it's exclusive, but I've encountered them as well. During my undergraduate studies, my university sat on the edge of a lake, and on the other side of the lake was the Canadian Military College where they train the officers. And there's some of those types of Norse pagans there. And through a friend of mine, I interacted with them because I was also a pagan. There wasn't really any other pagans at my school. And yeah, they had this kind of exclusive mindset. They're like, oh, you're just a scholar. Like, what do you know of pagan tradition? Like, you would never get to Valhalla, not including the fact that I'm not a Norse pagan. I never wanted to go to Valhalla, but I digress. They just thought, oh, you're going to hell because you're not going to die in battle. And it's like, are you going to die in battle? You're an officer commanding troops or like piloting a drone. Are you really this righteous warrior that you try to paint yourself as?
See, I find that ironic because most of those guys had never actually seen combat. And this group that I had encountered, it wasn't so much about being a soldier, but you had to have experienced combat. You had to have gone out and fought for your life in a warlike situation because they had 2 or 3 police officers on with them as well who were from New Orleans. And it wasn't that you were excluded, you just weren't allowed. On the Valhalla thing, their leader also said that wanting to go to Valhalla was stupid. You wanted to go to Freya's Hall because that's where all the tacticians are.
Right.
Would you rather be led by a guy who wants to charge bloodily into combat, or do you want to be led by Erwin Rommel? It was very much so kind of an eye-opening experience, and I did rituals with them for a bit. But as I said, Norse paganism never clicked. It never felt right. It felt like I was going through the motions over what I am now, which is, well, moon cultist is the best way to describe me, which is what feels natural, what feels good, it feels correct. I'm not at war with myself over what I am anymore, which is something that I find a lot of American pagans are at. They're at war with themselves.
And how did you get introduced to this moon cult? What about the moon in particular made you feel more comfortable in knowing that this was a spiritual path that you belonged on?
So it all started with Mitra. Like I said, we got very close. The 4 of us got very close, bonding over Daisy. Eventually, it was not so much even playing Daisy, it was just sitting on voice chat talking. And Mishra's belief is that he is a child of the moon, that he is a direct child of the moon. That doesn't give him special powers or anything. He just believes that the moon's his mom. By the time that I joined the group, the rituals and the idea that Soul had of starting a moon cult, starting a warrior lodge, where we would make oaths to each other, and it would give him the sense of brotherhood that he felt while he was in the army. So we sat down and we talked, and we took a name from a book that we all liked to name our group, and we did a ritual. Each of us individually, there was blood involved. I'll leave out the particulars, but we bonded to each other as brothers through this methodology.
Well, that's brilliant. I think that's totally upholding pagan tradition. I mean, among the Indo-Europeans, we call it the Koryos, this idea of the band of brothers working together to not only further their material ambitions in this world, but to further their spiritual progression.
Oh, it's completely and utterly that way with us. We are there for each other 24/7. I've fielded phone calls from these gentlemen at 2 and 3 a.m. I will always be thankful to Mitra. He gave me financial assistance one time that I still haven't paid off. Not that he wants me. We've taken care of each other. Their children, the oldest one, I'm uncle.
That's what it's all about, isn't it? It seems like the members of your particular cult group are so close. And I mean, I mentioned it in a post I made on Instagram. Most pagans I know get into it on their own through their own research. For most converts, it's a very self-focused effort, but ultimately, proper ritual practice and belief, community lies at the heart of our ancestral pagan traditions. At its origins, I'm so glad that I can go out there and meet people like you who are not only practicing paganism on your own in your own household, but are forming bonds, one could argue a tribe with like-minded individuals.
Well, we're taking it to that next level. Already, two of our members live within spitting distance of each other. Land has been acquired in Utah, and now it's just a matter of figuring out how we're all going to get to live in the same state and be a family. I mean, for lack of a better term, those men are my brothers. They are my blood. Erica, Soul's wife, she is a beloved sister to me, and her paganism and her ideas have helped the group heavily, especially with her contacts in the different spiritual groups that she associates with. And my best friend, she might as well be in it as well because she's been close to me and Mishra for years now.
Well, that's one of the beauties of having a close-knit group like this, right? And especially when you all have your own different spiritual paths, and you can not only integrate your traditions, but reach out to your outside sources, your own personal connections, and draw upon them for the health of the community. Even in my own experiences as a more strictly Indo-European pagan, and I deal a lot with worship of the Sky Father. Funnily enough, a lot of my content has been relayed among Turanic circles. These are people of Turkic or often Mongolian ethnicity or mixes between the two who worship their Sky Father Tengri, very similar to Dios Pater. Because of that, it's not only allowed me to make connections in these circles, but these people have offered me a glimpse into surviving ritual practices involving the Sky Father. And I think it's very valuable because I believe at a primal level, the Indo-European Sky Father worship and the Sky Father worship practiced amongst these groups must have been somewhat shared. It's great that your community living in this rural environment can draw upon all your different connections and really bring it in together to ensure the success of your tribal endeavor.
It's not been easy. We've gotten incredibly lucky with certain things. The land for the group kind of fell into his lap, and he was able to buy it free and clear. Soul works as a manager at a construction company. So acquiring the stuff to build the second house, which has been completed, was fairly easy. It's just money is going to be the time sink into this. Not that it's not worth doing, because anything worth doing is not going to be easy, especially in Mormon land.
Well, definitely, retribalization is not an easy effort, but I would argue, and many people would argue, in the long run, it's worth it. And it seems like you guys see that too.
I'm not sure how familiar you are with Mormonism, but it is an incredibly American version of Christianity that has its roots laying in sorcerer Joseph Smith. There are some Norse pagans who believe Joseph Smith was actually an aspect of Odin.
Interesting. That's more of that American syncretization going on.
It's more of Odin's role as the trickster. He thought it would be funny to make his own version of Christianity and knew that he would need strong settlers and things of that nature for the upcoming war. So he created Mormons. They're great people to live near. Would not go to their church, but I'd live near them.
Yeah, they seem like interesting people. You know, that's that's particularly funny because I feel like there's so much black pill propaganda against neo-tribalism and settlement efforts, you know, what some might refer to as communes, because people like to think like, oh, you know what happened at Waco and at Ruby Ridge, you know, the ATF's breathing down our neck. They're not going to allow you to do these things. But then you look at so many religious groups like the Amish or the Mennonites or the Mormons in particular. And yeah, they had their own struggles, but by moving out to these lands and settling the harsh lands, fighting the good fight, they've set themselves up in such a good position in the future. I'm somewhat familiar with Mormonism. I studied religion for my undergraduate degree in university. And to my understanding, you know, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like Mormonism was largely founded in the 13 colonies, or at least on the East Coast. And then a lot of the other Christians at the time were getting fed up with the Mormons trying to integrate their way into the structures of power. So the Mormons moved west and settled around, you know, the Utah Salt Lake area. And now it seems like their religious community is absolutely thriving simply because they were willing to do the hard thing and move to an area that was pretty much wild and tame the land and make it their own. And in a way, even though they're not pagans, it's almost pagan in a sense that they've become so integrated into the land. You know, their religion is very framed by the land they settled.
My best friend, the one I keep mentioning, she's a former Mormon, and she went through the entire process. And one of the reasons she is pagan now is because of Mormonism. I wouldn't say the religion itself is thriving, Business-wise, they're probably the richest church in the world. They made some wonderful investments early on, and their religion is set up so that if you don't pay the tithe, not only do you lose all your positions, you also get socially outcast from the groups. Oh, well, they don't have their temple recommend anymore, so they can't go to the special services. They keep an isolated and kind of structured existence.
Right.
But what you're seeing a lot now, and something I've noticed, is the past three pagans that I have met are former Mormons. And you see a lot of people leaving Mormonism for paganism. Whether or not that's anecdotal evidence or the sign of something deeper, especially with the Mormon church's interesting history. Joseph Smith was actually convicted of necromancy in New York, speaking with the dead. That was the exact charge that was placed against him. After he was killed by an angry mob, they moved out to Salt Lake City using handcarts of all things because Brigham Young didn't want to spend money on wagons.
I see. Well, maybe all these Mormons converting to paganism, maybe that was Odin's plan all along.
That's what some of the Utah Mormons I've discussed this theory with have stated that that's what this was. Mormonism is one of the more strict and controlling versions of Christianity, with interviews with your bishop. Worthiness interviews is what they're called, and quite a few very, very hardcore brainwashing exercises. So it seems like it's set up to funnel people into our lifestyle.
Yeah, no kidding. It's spiritual Semitism at an extreme that, almost makes you repulsed by it.
Exactly.
So your group is settling in Utah. Why Utah in particular? Was it just the convenience of the land, or was there other reasons you picked it? Maybe agricultural reasons or more spiritual reasons?
One of the people who used to be quite a friend of our group, he lived in Utah. He wasn't ever a part of our group. He was very much so like a father figure and a mentor to most of us. One of the guys was living in a trailer in California and decided that he just couldn't deal with it anymore. So he moved to Utah. When he got there, he met his lovely wife, Erica, and he managed to get her pregnant on their first date. So he wasn't going anywhere.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. Each of us has our own weird tie to Utah in some way, shape, and form. So when he settled down there, and once everything started to get set up, he got the deal on this land was ridiculous. I mean, he paid $20,000 for 100 acres of land.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a really good deal.
He bought it, and originally the idea was for him to just kind of have all this big land. But then whenever Mishra lost his job and moved there, the idea was hatched that we all need to get there. We all need to be together as a group. We all need to be not alone anymore. Our group motto has always been, we stand alone together, because, we were scattered throughout the United States. I'm in Louisiana. One of the guys was in Texas. The other two were in California. So it was very much so we rarely got together to see each other. When we got to see each other, it was always brief because we were, young men working on trying to build our lives. And now that we're all in our 30s now, we're all established, we're all getting our everything together, we find that we don't want to be alone and away from each other. So Utah has a number of advantages for us. The preparedness culture is heavy, very, very good gun laws. It's conservative. We're all conservative. And it's some place where we feel we can settle and make our lives and our tribes and raise our children. Plus, it has really good homeschooling laws, which I'm not sure how versed you are on homeschooling in the United States, but there are certain states that do not want you to homeschool your children. And I would never send my child to a public school.
No kidding. Yeah, it's an absolute battle in some jurisdictions. Unfortunately, my experiences with the United States have largely been limited to the more liberal states on the Eastern Seaboard. You're considered such an abnormality if you're homeschooled. And even to an extent, the stereotype exists in Canada. It's funny because in university, some of the people I met that were homeschooled, unfortunately, they were in university, and that's another brainwashing institution of itself. But regardless, some of the homeschool people I met were the most socially well-adjusted, most polite. I mean, it seems like the only thing they weren't is degenerates. So if being socially abnormal means you're not a degenerate, then, I'd much rather be socially abnormal than socially normal.
Well, I was homeschooled, so I have the experience of seeing the good and bad parts of it.
So Your community plans to homeschool your children, correct?
Yes. The oldest child, he's currently in what they call pod learning, which is 16 children, but the teacher goes to see 4 of them at a time. And he's doing incredibly well with that. He's very smart. We're actually all very, very proud of him. He took his initiation early. We were planning to wait for he was 13, but some things happened, and he said that he wanted to become a full member of the group. And he did it. He did everything that we did, and we're very proud of him for that. Now we had to carry him down the mountain, but that's another show.
Well, at least he was willing to show that spiritual readiness. I mean, it's such a wonderful thing to hear this. So many people who attack our community just attack us as LARPers or think that we're all converts. And by and large, the most of us are converts, but that doesn't mean our dedication or our zeal for our ancestral traditions is any weaker than it would have been if we were born into our traditions. But it's such a thing of beauty that we're now seeing the next generation being born, and they are being born into our traditions, and they adopt them with such fervor. They're so passionately interested in the myths and stories of our gods and our ancestors. And clearly, this young lad in your tribal community is very passionate about your traditions, and I'm sure he will pass that on to his own children.
Oh yes. His story is one of tragedy. We didn't know of his existence until less than a year ago. His father found out about his existence and then fought for custody and was able to get the child and get him away from a very bad situation. We're going to do what we can for him, and we're not going to force him into our belief structure. But he chose that belief structure on his own by seeing us, by seeing the way that we acted.
Well, you know what? Maybe it's because he came from such a harsh environment and he was introduced to this very close, loving, fraternal sort of organization. And not only were you communally linked, but also spiritually linked, perhaps to someone who's been through such hardships and such isolation. It's a very interesting thing. And it's not a wonder that one would be attracted to a thing like that. And I think that's by and large a reason why our pagan traditions are becoming so desirable for many people in the modern world. We live in such an age of chaos where the corruption of the adversaries is present everywhere you look, and at times it feels so isolating. Life itself can seem so bleak. And when you start to learn about these traditions of people living together and sharing their beliefs and the genetic and communal elements of religion, and the idea that someday, if our traditions can be rekindled with such a vigorous fire, that all of us can belong to such a community, that's so desirable for many people.
Oh, it absolutely is. People are looking for a home. People are looking for what was taken from them. People want to feel like what they do matters, and that whenever they do something for another, they see the effect of their actions. I'll give you a great example of this. I have to drive through a decaying urban center to work every day. And I see so many people who are homeless, who are struggling, who are having to sell their plasma for money. And I see them and I see them without that communal tribe. And I think to myself so many times, where's their family? Where are the people to step in and help them? And the group that we've established, I never have to worry about that. I know that if I fall and I stumble, if something happens, those guys will be there to catch me. If something happens to me, my best friend, she'll be there for me. I don't have to worry about that. And I'm there for them.
That's just beautiful. And you're absolutely right. And in that particular example, it's quite disgusting because obviously the selling of plasma, sure, it has medical purposes, but let's be honest, the selling of life energies of any sort, has obvious adversarial links. In the modern world, I think there's an intentional effort to deconstruct the family unit and to isolate people. All metaphysical and theological elements aside, perhaps it's because lone, scared individuals make more money. And that's the intentional reason it's designed that way. You promote not just a family, but something greater than a family, a community that's inspired and they practice. Their whole worldview is shared amongst you. I think that's so attractive to so many people. And I'm so happy to see that groups like yours are going out there and making the dream happen. They're not just LARPing. They're going out there, they're buying land, and they're reestablishing these community structures that are so central to calming the human psyche.
Well, we're never going to be a huge, huge group. We're always going to be. We've had this discussion. No one else is joining unless they're blood related or get married into it. That's how we're going to keep what we feel is proper. Someone might get adopted into it. All of us have this feeling that once we get to a certain age, we're going to have to give back. We're going to go out there and give back. But becoming part of the group, coming to live in Utah, whenever that happens, that's not going to happen. The insular, closed-in nature of these sorts of groups is what keeps them going, I think. You've gone to college. You've been a part of major group projects. Whenever you get above a dozen or so people, there's always some sort of drama and chaos. It's the nature of humans.
Oh, definitely. A lone stick on its own breaks easy. But if you have a small group of very thick sticks, sticks that are strong, they won't break. But if you have a big bundle of very weak sticks, it might as well break as easy as a singular stick. I think it's so much more important to have a small group of people who are really passionate about their community and their beliefs than it is to have a large group of people who are interested in it on a superficial level.
There was a pagan group in New Orleans that got too big. That started its downfall. They were, I'm not going to call them social justice warriors or anything like that. They simply got too big and they had no real mission statement. And the building they were leasing, one of the people who's leadership in the group, she ended up sending a voodoo doll to the building's owner out of anger. Very petty, but in New Orleans, that's as good as a threat. Well, New Orleans is a city that you took a city out of Europe and you just transported it to the deep south. There's a heaviness to the city that you come in when you go to New Orleans. And I didn't feel it until I became a pagan for the first time. Going into New Orleans, it was almost as if I didn't belong there, even though I had been going to New Orleans since I was a small child. But after my pagan awakening, it felt different.
Interesting. Would you say that the aura or the miasma of the city, would you say this is more of a positive thing or more of a darker energy?
If the adversary has a home in the United States, it's New Orleans.
Well, I guess that would explain all of the occult associations with the city. I mean, for me, it's personally quite heartbreaking because the city itself, New Orleans is named after Orleans in France, which is Aurelianum, the city of Aurelian. And so, of course, what better place for the adversaries to set up shop than the city named after the City of Souls champion?
Oh, it's incredibly heartbreaking because the city is beautiful. One of the weirder experiences that I've had in New Orleans, which I've had far too many weird experiences in New Orleans, most of them just involving drunk people. But I went to a voodoo ritual, full-on voodoo ritual. This is after I became a pagan. I'd been a pagan for about a year at this point, and I wanted to experience it. So I talked to one of my friends who knew an actual practitioner, not one of these, I'm going to pretend to be a voodoo priestess. No, this guy was legit, and he was holding a ritual for about 40 people. So we get there, and the chickens are squawking, and I know what's going to happen to the chickens. They're going to murder the chickens. And everything's getting set up, and he comes to me, and he says, "You need to get out." And I'm like, "I need to leave?" And I kind of look around, expecting maybe it's because I'm the only Caucasian person there. It's not that. There's plenty. It's New Orleans. He goes, "You have a spirit about you that I don't like." And I go, "What do you mean?" And he goes, "You have a spirit, a dark owl spirit around you." And I cannot help myself. I look at this man and go, "Who?" I am then kicked out of the building.
Classic.
It was very much so worth it. But owls are an incredibly important part of my faith as well. I haven't really talked about how I worship, but it's all nature-based, animal-based. Owls are an incredible, important part of my religion. I've got 2 small jade owls on my altar that I have set up in my home. So I kind of feel that him saying that there was a dark owl spirit around me was whatever actual animal spirit that likes me was getting me out of a situation I shouldn't have been in.
Yeah, no kidding. Particularly interesting considering that if we look at the Greek traditions, the owl is associated with the goddess Athena. There's a lot of mystery and lots of theories as to why the owl is associated with Athena. But one thing I think makes a lot more sense is that Athena is often associated with apotropaic images that scare away dark and evil energies. The most obvious example of this is the Aegis, Medusa's head on her shield. But I believe in itself the owl is also apotropic. So maybe if this is some sort of guardian spirit that manifests as an owl or is an owl and it's attracted to you, maybe in this situation it was protecting you or warding away the evil. And perhaps that's why the voodoo practitioner was so put off by your presence.
Well, the first owl that I ever had the experience of actually getting to meeting and holding was a bubo bubo, a Eurasian Eagle Owl. They're massive creatures. You have great gray owls up there, and they're bigger than great gray owls. They're Athena's owl. That is the very famous statue of Athena holding that owl out. That's a bubo bubo. Whenever they come to an area, they set up a nest and then proceed to start killing every other raptor and owl within 20 miles to kind of establish dominance.
Chad.
Yeah. Oh, actually, they were responsible for the extinction of an owl in the area around Carthage, of all things.
Oh my God, that can't be a coincidence.
Well, it's actually a fairly interesting story. You spoke of Lilith, and we've kind of touched on it a bit, but the Bubo Bubo is also Lilith's owl. And one of the Lilith worshippers I know told me a story that's passed down through their oral tradition is that Lilith does not like the way Moloch or Hammond acts at all. She hates him. The hurting of children is something that she cannot abide by, according to this Lilith worshiper. And so Lilith created the Bubo Bubo to hunt down Moloch's owl.
No kidding.
Mind you, this is from a Lilithian worshiper, and while their stories are fascinating, it's not something I'd necessarily believe in. But it does kind of tie into that struggle that these gods have against one another. I'm a very big proponent of the gods are at war with each other. They're fighting against one another. They're going after one another. And we see the effects in real life.
Oh, absolutely. Particularly with the adversaries. People had knowledge of these deities, but I feel like for a decent amount of the pagan community, I've opened their eyes to the adversaries at large, because a lot of pagans do originally convert from Christianity. They get caught up in thinking of them in a very demonic biblical sense, and that there's some sort of united force. But the adversaries don't necessarily like each other. A lot of them actually hate each other. And like you said, I'm pretty sure that Lilith would not like Moloch, considering that she's associated with sexual creative energies, and Moloch is, the manifestation and destruction of new life. Yeah, and it's interesting, obviously, because Moloch is associated with Carthage, and if this species of owl that's associated with Lilith did exterminate that other species of owls around Carthage, then there's a very physical, natural manifestation of this faction of deities warring with each other. Before we go any further, you had mentioned earlier a little bit about your shrine. Are you or your tribe planning on building any large temples or shrines to honor the gods in your Utah community?
Yes, Erica is close friends with someone who claims to be a descendant of the Oracle of Delphi, and this woman has established a shrine to Apollo in Utah, of all places. Now, that being said, we're going to argue about whenever we build ours about how to build it, but we at least have someone who knows kind of how to build what we want, because, well, each of us is going to want to have certain things. We'll have a shrine set up for our two important holidays, which are Samhain and Beltane. Out of our group, that's the two holidays that matter the most. But I think the only thing we're going to agree on is that the moon comes first. The moon is the thing that ties us all together. The moon is the thing that kind of keeps us connected. Each of us has a phase that represents us, that gives us certain duties and responsibilities in the group. Whenever we were writing the book, because we sat down and wrote a full ritual book.
It's quite thematically appropriate then that the thing that pulls you all together is the moon, isn't it? You mentioned that you had been appointed to this position of the Merlin. How exactly will you be structured and governed? Is this Merlin equivalent with the lead position in the community?
Sol's the leader. He's the guy who brought this all together. It's his land. He's always been the leader. To take the Indo-European thing, Sol is warrior caste through and through. His family has fought and bled for this country as far as they've traced back is the Revolutionary War. That's his family. He is warrior caste. He's the leader. He knows what he's doing. We all trust him. We may disagree and argue with each other at times, but none of us are going to go against Soul's word when he lays down the law. Just how it works. My role is to make sure that all the rituals are being done properly and ensure that there's proper balance when things get a little funky spiritual wise.
I see. That is quite Indo-European then. You do have that, I guess, not necessarily tripartite, but that structuring of society. The priestly role is allocated to one person's bloodline, and the noble ruling warrior role is assigned to another.
If anyone is of that bloodline, it's Soul. The joke we have is if he was born in Britain, some tart would be throwing a sword at him from a lake.
Classic. So clearly, your community will be living together on this land in Utah. Are you guys, as a community, aiming to be entirely self-sufficient, or will you still partially rely upon the resources of the outside world?
Anyone who says they're going to be completely self-sufficient has no idea what the hell they're doing. We've studied the feasibility of it for years. Anyone who's sat and told you that they're going to have a full off-grid community doesn't know just how hard that is. The land we have, it's near a small town. We'll still be working. People will be commuting to the major city to do their jobs. But we will live off the land as much as we can. However, the land isn't exactly what you'd call fertile. So we're actually looking at what's called aquaponics, which is, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that or your viewers are. Basically, it's using fish to fertilize hydroponically grown crops. So that's kind of what we're looking at. If water allowances would allow for that, great, but it's still something that's really in its infancy because, like I said, we're not all living together just yet.
I know Utah is big sky country. Have you considered a more pastoralist approach, like raising cattle or other grazing animals?
Well, I actually have experience with raising cattle, and I have experience with certain forms of kind of that pastoral life. And I'm gonna be honest with you, it's nice to talk about on the internet, but it kind of sucks. Water will still have to be pumped in, but self-sufficiency, the big thing is most likely going to be we're going to try to be as off-grid power-wise as possible.
I understand from an ideological perspective this desire to be self-sufficient. Obviously, we want to disconnect from the modern world as much as we can, considering that most people in the modern world see us as enemies or at least quite opposite to how they view the world. But yet, I feel we have a tendency to romanticize it. I mean, even if I very objectively look at the Indo-Europeans as a group, we like to think perfectly in a romantic sense that they were these nomadic steppe pastoralists. And they roamed around living entirely off of the bounty of their cattle and off of hunting. But realistically, and what does the archaeological evidence show, is that a lot of these groups, these young Koryos, would go out and they would raid other territories, raid the territories of farmers and hunters and gatherers. And no doubt, I'm sure some of these Koryos, after they settled in these lands, would probably send some of this back to their homeland as tribute, whether it be in slaves for labor or whether it be in grain or wealth resources like gold. I mean, even in that sense, they weren't perfectly self-sufficient. They were still taking things from others. And this is something I've tried to promote. My end goal is to form a community of sorts. And like you said, for certain things, you want to be off the grid as much as possible. But particularly in the Kali Yuga, you can't be entirely disconnected from the outside world because to do so is dangerous for the community in more ways than one. You need to know what's going on with the surrounding political situation in the outside world. You need to know about the economic situation in the outside world. You also need to know about the demographic situation in the outside world. As much as we'd like to just live perfectly off of crops, a community is going to need some sort of financial backing. And I don't see why, members of a commune cannot necessarily still work somewhat in the outside world, or at least have representatives of the community which is living more off the grid, living in the outside world and bringing back the resources to their community.
So one of the things about Utah is that there are already a ton of religious communes there. Mormonism has more splinter groups than you can possibly imagine. And quite a few of them are actually living the off-grid commune life, and they're living almost completely off-grid. In the area, there is precedence for it. However, pagan commune groups haven't really been done in the area. However, you're exactly right about having to have ties to the outside world, especially when it comes to living in this age. You don't want to be the strangers up on the hill. Soul is the manager at a construction company. He's out there in the public every day. In Utah, especially, you have to know people and have connections to make things work, especially if you're not part of the Mormon church. If you're not part of that Mormon church, things are harder because people are far more likely to hire Mormons than anybody else.
No kidding. There's always that communal favoritism.
Oh, yeah.
I don't live in Utah, obviously. I live in a part of northern Canada. But in my area, it's a very similar situation. We have a lot of these religious commune groups. The vast majority of them are Christian, particularly a group known as the Hutterites. They're kind of like Mennonites. They're largely off the grid. They practice their religion pseudo in secret. Their families live their entire lives on these farms. And even they are very invested, but they still go out into the nearby community and they sell. I mean, the Hutterites in particular are famous for chickens and eggs. So they sell their produce, they sell the things they gain to the outside world, and they take whatever resources or knowledge they need from the outside world back to their community to further the community's growth. For groups like this, you need to have this positive reputation in the nearby hub of society. Because, like you said, you don't want people to look at you as the crazy cultists on the hill. And I mean, as pagans, we're already facing a lot of negative media portrayals. The most recent example I can think of is, I'm sure you've heard of this movie called Midsommar. It's basically about this pagan commune in Sweden. And it's a very fantastic, dramatized account of quote unquote pagan rituals. And our culture has such a negative portrayal to the average person. A lot of people just don't know what pagans are, but the few who do know what pagans are generally have a negative association of us. So for our groups to do our own thing on our land is perfectly fine. But by having that positive reputation in another nearby community, as, oh, that's the friendly guy who sells good honey, or, oh, that's the guy who manages the hardware store, it humanizes us more to these people. And I mean, if you're in a situation like I am, where the nearest community is still 7 hours from the largest urban center, then in a situation where shit really does hit the fan in the Kali Yuga, these people are not going to be so scared of us. In fact, they might look to us favorably. And this could be to the benefit of our community. Your example for some can hopefully be quite inspirational in realizing that the path to our gods and our ancestral traditions is not necessarily straightforward. But as long as we have a good community around us, people that we can trust and invest our futures in and really rely upon. Well, Tyto, I want to thank you again for coming on to the show today. This has been a great talk, and I'm sure everybody's really going to enjoy it. Before I head off, is there anything you'd like to say to the audience?
Yeah. Speaking about the path, from my personal experience, I know Luna won't deceive you. She's there in the night sky in the dark to remind us that light always wins. That's what she is. She's a reminder in our darkest times. She was birthed by soul for that purpose. So just remember, when it's dark, you can always look up there and find her. And if she's not in the sky, she's hunting the adversary. Just remember, there's always light.
Well, that's quite beautiful. All right, Tyto, I want to thank you again. And to you, my viewers, I want to thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of the Son of the North podcast. I'm glad that I could have been your momentary escape from the soul-crushing insanity of the Kali Yuga. May the gods bless you and your loved ones in the week to come.